Cheers, everybody. Welcome to the Beer Enthusiasts. We're on episode 39, if you could believe it. Approaching on 40 just here on YouTube. And we're kind of chugging along on our series that's going through some of the different key points of the Master Cicerone syllabus. A little bit deeper dives on some more technical subjects, and we definitely want to try to help make it not super technical when we can, but also, as we might say in some form or fashion, every episode, this is an excuse to study for the Master Cicerone Exam. So we are going to be talking about the malting process today after a quick detour last episode, talking about that really cool Sierra Nevada beer that we got to help out in the malting process a little bit. So that's kind of a slight inspiration for doing a little bit deeper dive on the malting process. And we kind of just have a soft spot for it. Malt's the soul of beer. We got to hang out at a really cool malt house, and they were like so generous with their time and access. And I don't know, I feel like we learned a lot more in a couple of days hanging out at a malt house than we've read in basically all of the books that we've read. So that's an ode to hands-on experience and inspiration for why we just want to talk about the malting process. So what do you think, Scott?
Yeah. Well, obviously, the first thing Chris asked when we got on to practice recording was, he's like, "Hey, you got a beer with any malt in it?" And it was like, and I was like, "It's mostly, if not all, malt."
Yeah.
No, it's all malt. No, mine's double decocted Doppelbock. They call it a double decocted black bock, but I mean it's 7%. That's in Doppelbock range. And Wayfinder's awesome. They use decoction. So
yeah, and I brought. I'm drinking Notch's root beer, also double decocted, I believe, and kind of their take on the historical Nuremberg red lager style. So we brought some multi little beers for sure.
Yeah, and like Chris said, a lot of our I don't know about it. Have you actually been to like a pneumatic malt house, like one of the much larger ones that are a little bit more kind of pressing a lot more buttons and larger machines and all that kind of stuff? Yeah, I've only been to Admiral, where they exclusively do floor malting. So there'll be some parts of those two setups that are different when it comes to the process. Some things that are going to be a little bit similar. And also you're going to notice a lot of kind of recurring themes throughout each of the steps. There's really kind of a solid 3 to 5 kind of parameters that maltsters are almost trying to control at all times. It's usually things like temperature, airflow, levels of kind of water, hydration, or lack thereof. And moisture content, whether it's something that's in a kilning vessel or the moisture content of the malt itself. These are all the kinds of levers that maltsters are pulling and adjusting throughout the process to come up with, as we can see, all different kinds of malt that can make all the beers that we love. Because, as we all know, malt is known as the soul of beer. But before you really get into malting, barley starts in the field. Like, it's an agricultural product. It's got to be grown. So there's somebody that's got to grow it, and you've got to get it from a farmer. You've got to get it from a source. And obviously, when you're taking on a product, there's some criteria that kind of need to be met for it to be acceptable. Because there are just certain things about barley, and then when we kind of move it through the malting process. These special sort of distinctions that they have that make them great for brewing. So a couple of them are you just want them to be, you want the barley that you're getting to be in good shape, right? You don't want it to have a lot of insect damage or pre-sprout damage. You don't want just all the husks to not be intact. That's a super important part of the barley kernel that is necessary for, at least for ease of parts of the brewing process. Obviously, you can do it without it, but then you've got to have some special equipment or things like that to make it work. But you also want, kind of uniform looking kernels. You want them to be able to actually come out of, dormancy and begin to grow. We'll talk a little bit about how we kind of get barley to do that during the malting process. And then there's just certain sort of internal structural parts that we really want. Protein levels are really one of the big concerns when it comes to barley. So that's again something we'll kind of talk about as we get through it. But we want all of those things to kind of either be in acceptable ranges, or just from a physical standpoint, we want the barley to look and be sort of living the way that we want it to be. And the barley, when it comes from the field, obviously it's growing throughout the year, and so there's times when it takes up its own moisture via rain, or if it's watered by the farmer. And so it comes in with some moisture content, but part of the goal is that we want the barley to start to undergo that sort of metabolic process of growing, and that's where the first major step comes in. And the first major step is steeping, and the two real main goals are to further clean the barley, because it's coming from a field. It's going to have some some impurities. It's going to have some dirt. Like it's coming from the ground. And then the other part is we're trying to hydrate it. So usually it's going into either a single vessel that does a particular step. Another part of it, again, it depends on the malt house. Some malt houses have vessels that are known as steeping, germination, and kilning vessels, where it's essentially all in one. It's kind of like one, kind of thing does all three steps. So, you don't have to transfer it from one to the other. When we were at Admiral, obviously, they were just steeping it in one thing, and then it was moved around quite a bit to all different parts of the malt house. But so the first thing you're doing is you're using obviously good, clean, and you're using water to kind of wash out all of the debris at first. So you're kind of filling up the steeping vessel with water. The water might even kind of like turn like brown, or might kind of look dirty, but you're getting all of that debris to come off of the surface of the barley, and then you're wanting it to. In some cases, it could just be that they allow the steeping vessel to overflow. And so eventually you're just kind of circulating the water, and eventually it kind of gets clearer and clearer. And then there's obviously those would have some special kind of design so that it collects some of that water. But you might need to kind of, need to work it through a couple of times.
Yeah, it's kind of like, think about it like rinsing your rice at home. You're kind of like, you're really, the main objective is you're cleaning it. You're going to do some hydrating later when you cook the rice, obviously, but you're just, you're kind of like rinsing the starchiness off of it, any debris, any little rocks that are in there. And you may have to do it multiple times to just like get some fresh water on there, drain it back out. And it's really the same idea. You're just, besides hydrating it, you're just trying to clean the malt up.
Yeah. So once you kind of do that, and you've got the malts to kind of clean to, the way that the maltster wants it, then the second goal, and most importantly in steeping, is that you're trying to actually hydrate the kernel. So, it's usually coming in around kind of like, 10, 12, 13, ish percent. Obviously, that's just going to depend on other agricultural conditions, or maybe the particular weather that year. But you're looking to significantly raise that moisture content. Another thing I should have mentioned at the beginning too, some of the numbers I'll give, these are kind of general statistics for certain things, much like different types of yeast or different types of hops. There are different types of barley varietals, and so they can meet different goals or achieve certain things differently than others. Than other types of barley varieties. So moisture content would be one. So you're kind of looking to get it into like the 42 to 48% moisture content range. Again, some barley varieties will be ready and do everything you need it to do at 42%, and others may need a little bit more time to kind of take on some more moisture to begin to start kind of that metabolic process that we want them to be going through. But really, it's done in these stages where you're exposing the barley to a water treatment, and then you are draining it of the water, and then you're giving it access to air because you want it to be kind of in respiration. If you were to allow it to kind of switch to having to kind of figure out how to live in a different way, you might get some weird like flavors and weird aromas and stuff, or you could just outright kill the barley just by drowning it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then the other important part is once you are exposing it to the air, barley does produce carbon dioxide during this process. So there's some air that's kind of pulled through the steeping bed that clears it out a little bit. Again, it's just all about making sure that the barley has access to oxygen so that it can just continue respiration as usual. But again, the temperature of the water, that's going to determine how quickly the moisture content is going to go up. The warmer the water, the faster the barley will take up moisture. And again, you need airflow and you're using hydration. So you're using, again, a lot of these levers that we talked about at the beginning. So, for example, you do X amount of hours, in a steep, and then you do X amount of hours of an air rest, and then you kind of alternate those two processes. And eventually you're just trying to get it to the moisture content that you want. And at every, stage of this too, this was one of probably the more fascinating things I think, we kind of got a sneak peek into working at Admiral for a couple of days, is just all of the things that they do to just tell when they need to move it to the next, part of the process. I mean, it's literally collecting, and either looking at something physical or putting it through a particular kind of regimen to see if it's, at full moisture content. Sometimes that's machines that they put them in that, run these really complicated tests and shoot out a moisture content number, and others where, it's like we're trying to see if the barley's actually taking up, if the internal structure of it looks, kind of like it's rice is I'm glad you mentioned that, because if the barley kernel is not kind of swelled and moist, it just kind of looks like a pasty kind of white color. But if it has taken up a lot of that moisture, it does kind of look like a translucent kind of grain of rice. And that was, literally, I've got, pictures of Chris just with an X-Acto knife, just cutting individual barley kernels. But you assess, what that looks like. And we were kind of given certain specs to look for. And then they were like, okay, great. Like now that means this is fully steeped. And so now we're going to, get to moving it to the next part of the process. But another thing that I think is also, becoming talked about a lot more, especially in malting, is just the sustainability part of it. And, this is a part that, it takes a lot of water and it takes a lot of, there's a lot of, just raw materials that you need for this process to happen. And so there's lots of interesting ideas. One extreme is just, how do we just use barley without malting it to potentially make beer? And some people are, fully on board with that, all the way to, when I was over in Europe and was visiting the School of Brewing at one of the schools in London, they were working on a piece of technology where you were going to be able to do all of the steeping you needed for all of your barley in one, like 12 or 14 hour step, and it was going to like drastically reduce water. And so we're trying to figure out what are some ways that we can kind of improve this so that it's a little bit more sustainable, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, it seems like that's the search in pretty much all facets of brewing, is how do you make it more sustainable? How do you use less water to create the same thing? But, malting is also just a very ancient practice. People think, you see all this industrialization in these huge malt houses or whatever, but ancient civilizations knew that in order to make barley more digestible, malting it, maybe they didn't have the similar language to use for it, but they would sprout beans, grains, seeds, all that stuff to make them easier to eat.
Yeah.
So this is ancient knowledge. This is nothing new. It's just on a different scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And fun that there are people who are kind of taking a step back and using some of these older, because it used to just be floor malting. That used to just be the way things things were done before the Industrial Revolution. So then the kernel is it's swelled, it's got all this moisture in it, it's going to start thinking, okay, it's time to grow. We're going to start figuring out how we need to become a full grown like barley plant. Let's figure out how we're going to grow a stalk. And so the maltsters take again, depending on the setup, either transfer the barley into a separate what's called either a germination vessel, or in the case of floor malting, it would just be you're literally transferring it to a floor that's temperature controlled. Some of the differences there are going to be just the depth of the bed. If you're in a pneumatic malting setup, can be as much as like 55, 60 inches. I mean, you can get quite a tall, bed of the grain. Whereas when we did it at Admiral, it was literally this kind of makeshift. I don't even know what you would call it. Essentially, imagine a push broom where you took off the broom part, but still kind of had that piece of wood at the top, and then just added two little things on the side at the exact height they wanted the grain bed at, and then it was just you used that to kind of even it out. It was a very lots of creative stuff happening there for sure on many levels. But you're trying to get this even sort of bed depth. And then you're trying to start helping it continue, this process of growing, and the germination process is the part that's kind of up next. And once again, kind of back at the same things, you're looking at the amount of time that it's going to take you, the temperature that you want all of the grain to be at, the potential hydration that you might need to use if you're wanting germination to go longer. You might have to supply some air that's maybe a little humid, that has some moisture to it, and kind of make that flow through, especially maybe a larger bed. You might need to do that in a pneumatic setting. That wasn't something that we did at Admiral, but literally it was just walk around and take a thermometer and stick it at the bottom part of the bed and at the top, and pick 6 or 7 spots that are kind of in different parts of the grain bed, and record what the temperatures are. And then you kind of had the range of the temperatures that were acceptable, that were closer to the floor, closer to the temperature control. It was okay if those were a little lower, and then obviously towards the top you could be a little higher. But
yeah, well, and it makes a lot of sense if you think about it, whether you're thinking in terms of floor malting, or you have these big cylindrical germination tanks that can be quite large in the bigger malt houses. The goal is to germinate as uniformly as you can. So in the case of floor malting, that's just a lot of just like the ambient temperature is doing the work, even though the floor is temperature controlled in some fashion in modern floor malting malt houses. Yeah. But really the environment itself, the more even that your bed is doing the work, because all the external air pressures and temperatures are being applied as evenly as possible. That's the entire thesis of laying it out on a floor. Sort of like, if you're drying out a towel, if it's hanging, it's going to dry a lot more evenly than if it's in a clump on the floor. And it's the same principle in the big tanks. It's just a different machinery, because they're still controlling the variables such that as much as they can, each of these like millions of barley kernels are germinating as uniformly as possible, that they're all about the same stage of the process at any given time. That's wild.
Yeah, absolutely. And then once again, another thing that I hope is kind of a theme is that while you can implement as much technology and things like that to something like malting, There are just some parts where it's just, can you look at the kernel and can you kind of, and what can you gather from just its physical appearance or something like that to kind of say, okay, this is kind of where it's at. Even just from a sensory standpoint, I know plenty of people who have gone into malt houses, and you can kind of tell where in germination it is, because some people, the sensory note I've heard a lot is that there's kind of this smell of like a little bit of like a fresh cucumber, kind of vegetal like smell, kind of closer to the beginning of germination. So there's lots of other ways to tell kind of where the barley is. Obviously you can stick it in a machine that can measure moisture content or friability or something like that. But for germination, obviously one of the big things you really want to be seeing is something called chits. And it's basically the little rootlets that are at the end of the barley kernel. And this is why one of the big parts of germination is that you need to be rotating or turning the grain bed at various intervals. Because really, if you don't, you eventually would just be able to like stick your hand into a pile and lift it up, and it would just be this large kind of clump of these rootlets, kind of all becoming, just be kind of like matted, like hair almost.
Yeah, and so essentially the insides of those,
really, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the insides of those tangled balls can get moldy. They don't have as much airflow through them to then dry back out later. So, yeah, that's part of making it as even as possible.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. That's a good point. Eventually, you'll either get mold, or even if it's, especially if you're at, like a 55, 60, inch grain bed, you might even suffocate, the barley as well, because you are going to want a little bit of airflow as the bed depth gets thicker and thicker. Something for floor malting, usually just the turning of the grain is usually enough, where you don't really have to worry about that. And again, there's a range for doing that. A range from these giant, almost corkscrew, machinery where it just kind of goes in and spins, and it just slowly kind of turns and evenly kind of moves around the grain, to literally just taking like a pitchfork of some kind of looking thing and just dragging it through. I know at Admiral we had that kind of automatic thing where we plugged it in and you could kind of drag it along, and it would turn turn it automatically. But even then, I think that particular machine kind of had trouble when we got like right up against the wall. And so we even had to they were just like, hey, you want to work here? Why don't you go grab a shovel and, start, just work your way up the wall all the way across the grain bed and move it around.
It could be as simple as using a snow shovel to just turn it piece by piece. And that is literally what they do at Admiral Malting on the edges, either by pillars or against the wall, where it's difficult to get the machine to do it as well.
That's right.
Yeah, they had these big support beams in their warehouse, and they were like in the middle of the malting beds, the floor malting beds. And so, but on that similar subject of just literally turning with your own physical labor the malt on the edges of the bed, I was shocked at how much physical analysis that we did at every step, right? So not just the labor part of it, but when we were like seeing their first step, credit to them, they do have a lot of the bells and whistles as well to do some of the analyzing and the different machines and, moisture content, friability, all of those things. But their first step was always a physical examination by themselves. You want to know how much moisture is in the malt or is in the barley at this point? Pick it up and look at it. Can you pop it like a zit? Can you, can you pull it apart easily? Is it too brittle? Did it get any water? It's all just like, at the end of the day, there has to be a human taking a closer look. And it just shocked me how much that was all over every step of the process.
Yeah. Absolutely. And then obviously there's these kind of external, physical things that you're looking for in the germination process, or just trying to, make sure don't get out of hand. With the chits and rootlets kind of being, clumped together. But really the important part of germination is the sort of internal, sort of biochemical, and physiological stuff that's happening within the kernel. And this is, one of the more important parts for, where, we eventually turn sort of barley into malt that's going to be usable for brewing. And this is known as modification. Barley kernels have this internal endosperm, and this is where it's kind of the sort of energy source of the barley kernel, and it's just got within the endosperm there's this internal starch granules, and they're all sort of surrounded by these protein and carbohydrate matrices, and that's really what makes enzymes not able to access starch very easily. And so part of germination is getting the barley kernel to break those matrices down using its own biochemical processes. And so now, again, the barley kernel is thinking that it's going to grow. The rootlet or the chit will eventually become the stalk. And that's what, when it is obviously in the ground, that's when it would start to, come out of the ground. And so then it releases some hormones that then activate enzymes that are already within the barley kernel. These are some enzymes that if you are into brewing in any way, you've probably heard of them. Things like alpha or beta amylase. These are going to convert any of those starches into more simple sugars that the barley kernel can then use to continue growing and continue its metabolic process. But then there's others like protease enzymes that are meant to break down those protein or carbohydrate matrices around those starch kernels. And this is the modification that brewers really care about, because then you're going to be able to use still those enzymes that are preserved in certain types of malt. Those will again be activated in the mash and will have all of that starch to work on to create the sugar profile that you need for wort to make the type of beer that you're making. But also these proteolytic enzymes that work on proteins, these are what break down these proteins into these polypeptides and amino acids that are often referred to as, what eventually becomes free amino nitrogen, which is essential for yeast health. So, but again, you can kind of underdo that if you've ever heard about, barley that's kind of under-modified. We both talked about that we're having beers that, use the brewing method of decoction. That may be something you would use for something that for a malt that's been under modified, and some of it might just be to free up some of those to kind of break down and do essentially some of this internal work just in the brew house rather than in the malt house, because you might need to have more of those amino acids and free amino nitrogen content for yeast health and for proper fermentation. But again, it's kind of figuring out how do we get it to the point where, okay, this is where we kind of want to stop, because you really don't want it to, because again, this was another sort of physical, part of it. And it was like, I hope you can remember, I wish I would have looked up, I think was it called forking? I think was what it was called, where the where the acrospire kind of comes out, but then it kind of starts to spread in two different directions and almost kind of starts to split. But it was interesting because they almost kind of referred to it as like the F word, because like that's obviously not what you want all of your barley kernels to to look like, because that would not be good. That means you've taken the process a little too far. But again, like I said, we would do, I believe it was something called a hydration index, where we would literally create these little mini mashes and put the germinated barley into 140 145 degree water, and then we would take them out and cut them open and see how much water had gotten into the the internal part of the kernel, and that would kind of show how much the protein and carbohydrate matrices had been removed, and how much easier it was for moisture to be taken up. Because if you think about it, before this had happened, steeping to get it to get moisture takes days. And now we're just trying to do it in, a matter of 15, 30 minutes or something like that. So, there's obviously some physiological change that's happened to allow for such a time difference. And then the other one we would do too, I think, was called a growth index, and we almost had to peel away the husk over the acrospire, and we kind of had to say, like, is it halfway up the kernel? Is it 3/4? Is it one? Is it more than one? And then if it was forking, I think those were kind of the levels. And, you want them kind of in, I think the 3/4 to 1 is kind of, what you want the majority of that growth to be at. So, but again, I mean, just something where you can just physically look at the barley yourself and you can have a really good idea of where you're at.
Yeah. And, the folks at Admiral were obviously incredibly good at that, just like looking and being able to determine real quickly. And we're trying to like get inside the kernel and see exactly where everything is. But you can almost see the acrospire on germinated malt, almost like it's, someone hiding behind the curtain, and just like, can you see the outline and how far does it go? How tall is the person behind the curtain? And it was, we did an analysis where we did like several batches of 100 kernels just to see what the average was, and you want as much of the malt to be in a similar stage of the process as possible. And if you did your job every step along the way and nature did its, equivalent job, then you're pretty close.
Yeah, absolutely. So now the malt has germinated, and now we have what's referred to as green malt. So then in the malt house that we were at, again, transferred to the kilning vessel where the next step of the process takes place, which is called kilning. Again, sometimes these take place in the same vessel as some of the other steps. But the goal now for kilning is to dry the malt. That's one of the main goals. Is now you're trying to get it to somewhere around like the 4 to 6% range. This is so it can be stored properly, and it doesn't, again, like you said, doesn't get moldy, all that sort of stuff. And then also, if you think about it, if you have, however many pounds of malt, if let's just say it's at 20% moisture, that's a lot of weight. And so once you dry and get all of that moisture off, then it actually just becomes significantly easier to ship and to move around. And, so that's another big part of it. That I think I don't always think about, don't think about those kinds of things, but definitely, super duper important. And then also kind of, again, depending on the kind of malt that you're trying to make, you might be looking to preserve, some of the enzymes that are still in the barley kernel. For others, you might be sacrificing enzymatic activity for other things that you're trying to achieve, like flavor, like color. So again, it's just kilning is probably the one where it really kind of takes a pretty experienced maltster to really kind of, I mean, it's almost when you really kind of study it, it really is like a chef. Essentially, that's just making something to the specs that they want to make it to. There's, from my understanding, there's even at kind of the most industrial forward places, you still just have there's just still sensory that goes into it. The visual aspect, it's not a ton of like, we're just gonna, set it and forget it and hit the 1 minute, cook time on the microwave type thing.
Yeah, and we should say too that really no matter what type of malt it's going to end up being, the other main purpose of kilning is you're just locking in the germination profile. You're stopping it from germinating more, or from modifying more. You've got it kind of right where you want it, and then once it's dried out, in the sense that the plant itself is no longer being tricked into growing. That's where the chef takes over, right? And think about it like cooking something low and slow versus high heat and fast. even if you get to the same endpoint in terms of color development, moisture content, the end product is going to be different. There are going to be sensory differences between those two, even though they kind of like look the same and ended up in the same spot in a lot of respects. It's kind of like the difference between a hard sear or, sous vide cooking. There you have all these. This is why Scott says it's like a chef. This is where you get to take over and build the type of malt that you want to express itself in the finished beer. And there are hundreds and hundreds of philosophies about that. And we've kind of set them, this is for another different episode probably. This isn't going to be about all the different kinds of malts, but, we lump them into base malts, specialty malts, and there are chocolate malts and roasted malts and all these different things. But within each of those kind of super categories, everybody makes it a little bit differently. And that seems to be, at least with respect to the big maltsters, what they're the most secretive about, right? Like, exactly how did you cook it? And they don't really want to say. They have all this proprietary information about what produces their caramel style malt or whatever it may be. So, but you're just locking in the modification profile and kind of drying it out and cooking it to stop it. And then you make the malt you want to make.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, to drive this home, really just a few basic things that, the maltster is using during the kilning process. The amount of time, the temperature, the airflow, even the sort of quality of the air. Is it dry? Is it moist? Is it, are they trying to create, sort of a more humid environment? Like you mentioned caramel malt, crystal malt, those things, it's set to a certain temperature, they kind of close it off, and then the air that they use is a moist, they don't kind of try and get rid of the moisture as much, because you're kind of trying to create almost this kind of mash-like environment, kind of in that like 148 to 162 range. And then also different types of vessels that you can use. You can use kind of your standard kilning vessel, the one that was at Admiral. I mean, it literally just looked like a giant kind of, 3D rectangle box, outfitting. Also, you could use a roasting drum. I mean, if you've ever been to a place that roasts their own coffee and seen them, kind of the roasting drum moving and making coffee beans, very similar. Because again, it's kind of this rotational movement, and it allows for really even heating. And then for something like crystal malt, that's going to see time at some point in a roasting drum. But kilning is really kind of two basic steps. It's the withering step and the curing step. You can definitely break those down into subcategories. But for our purposes, withering is really, you're just trying to get rid of that kind of initial external moisture that's around the, kind of, directly on the outside of the barley kernel and maybe on sort of the just below the surface. But then at some point, the moisture evaporates, and then the temperature is actually able to kind of get above, because it's, with evaporation, it's going to kind of keep the temperature from getting too high, the more moisture there is. But then once it gets to the point where I believe it's referred to as the breakthrough, this is where then enough of the moisture content has left and is no longer in the air that then it can start to get up to higher temperatures, and then begins the curing phase, where then you're choosing how much color are you going to develop, and again, what levers are you trying to preserve enzymatic activity and use lower temperatures, like 150, 170 for pale or base malts. Are you looking to have, more of like high, hydride kilned malts, like a darker kind of like Munich style malt, where you're doing it initially at 170, but then you're turning it up to, maybe 230. And then are you just taking it, all the way, and you're trying to get up to like 350, 400 degrees and, make chocolate or black patent malt. So that at that point, again, like Chris said, you're just kind of giving the chef the different the different tools and the different types of either dry or moist heat and all that kind of stuff, and then they're just making their product at that point. With this in mind, one thing to note, there are other sorts of grain-based ingredients that maltsters can make. You can also just go, straight from raw barley to something like a roasting drum and make something like roasted barley. That's why roasted barley is not actually considered a type of malt, because it hasn't actually gone through the malting process. There's also lots of stuff in between. And even with just some of the basic stuff that we mentioned, there's kind of like ways that you can combine those. There's not just rye malt, or there's not just chocolate malt. There's chocolate rye and chocolate wheat, and there's lots of different things that you can kind of weave to kind of make different types of malt. There's special B is like a whole nother thing.
And it's worth saying too that you can malt pretty much any cereal grain, right? So there's malted corn, malted rice, malted wheat. And those undergo the similar process, and those can all be roasted or kilned to the similar degrees that you would do with malted barley. That's how you get your midnight wheat, or you get your chocolate rye, which you already mentioned, or most of the time, right? Malted rice or malted corn it doesn't seem like people make like dark roasted versions of those. There's probably a physical reason not to that I'm unaware of, but point being that you can malt all of those things as well. And although some of the biochemical composition of those seeds and grains are different, the processes are very, very similar.
Yeah. And then there's other things in the malt world that are exciting when it comes to flavor. I know this. I forget their name, but they have been for a while have had a product, and it's called infusion malt, where they're literally infusing things like cinnamon or like other spices, so that you don't have to actually add those things at some other point in the brewing process. They're just you just add a certain percentage of that particular infusion malt to your mash, and then that carries through to the finished product. I'm sure that person did kind of like a whirlwind tour. I'm sure if you listen to False Bottom Girls, I know that's where I heard this person speak about infusion malt. So check out the episode on that, because that's just like that's a whole nother thing that I don't totally understand. But there's lots of, just like anything else, just like in yeast or hops or anything like that, there's interesting and exciting things that are going on in the world of malt. And then what I would argue, at least for us, was the toughest part: putting the malt into something to be stored in, like a bag. when we did that, was so. It was essentially just kind of like this. It was almost like this automatic like thread, And for anybody who's opened a bag of 55-pound grain or whatever, you've seen the twine, that kind of is at the top of that, and we had to kind of pull down this part of the machine. But if you didn't hold it down, it would just rise back up on its own, and so. Eventually we were doing it, and then at the end you kind of let up, and then you kind of don't finish it the whole way. And that was by far, we were just like, okay, well, we could never do this. So we just thought and then somebody else who's worked there for years, they're just like, oh, you mean like this? They're just like not even looking and, and doing it perfectly. And
to people who hadn't done it before, it felt like trying to use a sewing machine that was on a bungee cord, just like.
That's exactly what it was like. Oh my gosh, that's such a great way to put it. But and then another good thing to sort of to mention, once malt is made, it actually doesn't perform super well in the brew house if you were to take it straight from the malt house when it's been packaged and throwing it right into your mash tun. It's not like It's not like hops where you can take, wet or fresh hops and just kind of throw them in and get something cool out of it. Usually they just don't perform super well and can lead to some different kinds of off flavors. So usually like storing them for like 3-4 weeks at a minimum is usually what's done by maltsters, and then they're ready to be sold.
Because they're still kind of like degassing in some ways too, right? If you just use it too quickly, they just haven't quite cured all the way, or they still contain some flavor and aroma compounds that you might not want.
Yeah, I think there's flavor and aroma stuff. I think they've found that there are some like particular enzymes that also decrease a little bit just with storage time. I want to say I'll look into it a little bit more, but I want to say lipoxygenase enzymes, which is one of the precursors, or not precursors, but it's the enzyme that aids in the creation of trans-2-nonanol in the mash. I believe that sort of decreases over that storage time. And then I know, I believe isobutyraldehyde is another one that you can kind of fall prey to if you were to use malt that hasn't been, just kind of stored for that 3 to 4 week period. So yeah, there's definitely some science behind it, and don't know anybody who's really messed with that, because it seems like it's just not a good idea.
Yeah, luckily, in kind of just regular brewing practice, by the time the malt gets to you, it's already finished with that resting period, basically. Yeah. The maltster has to bag it all up, and then it gets trucked off to the supply company, and then it's purchased from the supply company, and then it gets to the brewery. And
yep. Yeah. And then another thing I'll just I'll mention too, because we mentioned the word a couple of times, and it's relates to kilning. Someone might be asking, oh, like, why do you want 4 to 6% moisture? Why wouldn't you just get rid of like as much as you can? Then it's cheaper to ship. I'm giving all of these reasons why, you get it to, you dry it out. We mentioned the word friability a couple of times, and this is essentially how well, malt can be crushed. So obviously, low friability means that you can just run it through and it's just super, if you've ever like actually chewed on like raw barley, like it's actually like extremely hard to chew. And it's just so rough. Obviously you don't want that, but if it's too friable, you don't want to just put it through your mill and it just turns to dust. So there is a little bit of a sweet spot there, and that's what the term kind of friability means. It's just how easily or not easily does it just break apart under pressure. So yeah, it's another reason to kiln to a certain spec.
The malting process really feels like a delicate Goldilocks dance, right? For literally every step, you're trying not to go too far and to stay within a range, whether that's moisture, temperature, aging, whatever it may be. You just, it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating.
Absolutely. Well, that was a super fun episode. Do you want to give the folks a little preview about what you're going to be talking about on the next episode?
Yeah, we will, from time to time, we'll have some themes where we'll do episodes that piggyback off of each other. But in general, we're going to jump around different topics a bunch. And so don't read into that too much. It's just kind of things we either think that we need to study or that we're just super jazzed to talk about, whatever the reason may be. But one of the topics that I thought would be super interesting would be to talk about phenols and how yeast produces phenolic compounds, and there are a couple of different places in both the Advanced and Master Cicerone syllabi that kind of mention this, and so we'll probably break it into 2 parts. We've sort of philosophically decided to be as granular as we want to be. It's our show; we can do what we want. Yeah. The next episode will be about phenols, but it'll be primarily about kind of the genotypes of yeast and what they do that creates these phenolic compounds. It won't be quite as much it'll be sort of like this episode, kind of the process of how they're created and less about all the different types of outcomes of phenols. And then we'll do a different episode about that at some point.
Awesome. Yeah, looking forward to that.
Well, that's it. Nice and malty. Still got a little
Yeah.
bit of beer left. Feeling good. Thanks for guiding us
Samesies.
through that.
Yeah.
Next episode's going to be episode 40. So thanks for sticking with us. If you're been watching, appreciate y'all tuning in. Put us on 1.5 or 2 times speed and learn about malt, and let's have a day. But thanks for watching. We're the Beer Enthusiasts. You can find Scott on social media handles at Vintage Beer Enthusiast. I'm Chris at Fresh Beer Enthusiast. And, give us a like. Ask some questions. Tell us where we're wrong. Love that as well. Anything helps quite a bit. And subscribe to the channel and just follow along with us as we try to attempt this exam again. We appreciate you being here.
Yeah. Cheers, everybody.
Cheers.